So I have enjoyed playing World of Tanks. And I have this series on the channel here of some of the tanks that I have built based on the World of Tanks game. One of my favorites, I got a couple that I really like, but one of my favorites is the T25-AT. It turns out it's a tank that was never built. It was just a design, and it was based on the T25, and the T25 is part of that T20 series that pretty much had a Christie suspension. What eventually came out of the T20 series was the T23, which the turret was used late in the war on Sherman tanks with the 76mm gun, and the T26. And the T26 turned into the Pershing that was used in the late part of the war. Well, the T25 was very similar to the chassis of the T26. It was a little bit lighter armored. They had tried it out with a vertical volute suspension. They had tried it out with a horizontal volute suspension, and I believe in the very beginning it even had one of those early vertical volutes that was very similar to what you had on an M3, the M3 Stuart, that is, the light tank. Anyway, the T25-AT in the game is a tank destroyer, and it has kind of a casemate on top of a T25 chassis, and it's armed with a 105mm high velocity gun, which is pretty neat. It's got this barrel that's like 30 feet long. It's this great big thing. It's kind of wacky looking, kind of neat though, and as it turns out in the game, with its vertical volute suspension, it's got a GAF engine, as I believe, the Ford, the big Ford V8. It actually moves pretty well. It's very maneuverable, and it has quite a punch to it with that 105 gun. So I have a lot of fun playing with it, and I think it looks kind of cool. And so I wanted to build a model of it. But of course, there's no T25 out there, certainly not this particular thing. So I had to modify some existing kit. First I tried it with a Sherman, and then you'll see in this video, I kind of canned that idea and went to something else. But stick with me, and we'll show you my build of the T25-AT. Today we're going to look at one of the more rare and interesting pieces that I have. It's very unique to me, and that is the T25-AT. You will find this in World of Tanks. My version is a little bit different because of the way I had to build it. There's not a kit available of this particular tank, but what I did, I really wanted one of these. I thought this is kind of a neat looking tank, and I've enjoyed playing with it on World of Tanks. My version, what I did is I started out with a Duster kit. I can't remember, M42 or whatever it is. It's an old Tamiya Duster kit that I had started out with. And the one problem is there's one less road wheel than on the tank in the game. Guess what? This thing had never been built. Anyway, it's my model. Yeah, I'm okay with it. I had tried to build it on a Sherman tank chassis at one time, and that was a total disaster. But this turned out to be pretty good, this particular chassis. So this is how the deck looks with the arrangement that I have, and it's similar to what is in the game. I completely scratch built the casemate for the gun, and I tried to keep it as true to the game as I could, using a loader's hatch from a Sherman and a cupola from a Sherman as well. There is one place where I really deviated, though, because again, this had never been built, never existed really. So thought, was supposed to have like a 105mm gun. Good for it. But about that same time, they were also developing the 155 for the T30 tank. And I just happened to have an extra from one of my T30 tack-on kits. And I thought, well, that kind of looks cool on there. So I went ahead and put on the 155 millimeter gun. You'll notice what I did here for the mantlet is I took a nose from a 48 scale B17, that clear nose, and cut it up a little bit. And then I took a ball turret from a 48 scale B17 and used that. And it's, well, again, you'd have to look at the game and see, but I think it turned out pretty darn good for what it was, as far as the scratch build. Anyway, I threw a camouflage scheme on it that I use in the game. It's a supposedly a World War II scheme that was used in the Pacific, and I thought it looked pretty good on there. And then, of course, threw a few stowage items on it, just for S&G. The exhaust is off of a M26 Pershing kit and is very similar to the one that is used in the game. So there it is, my version of the T25-AT.
So here we are in the garage looking at my profile, and here's the tank on my profile. You can see the camouflage pattern used in the late part of the war in the Pacific, and I really like the look of this. I've seen several pictures of Shermans and some other vehicles painted with something very similar to this. This tank in the game that I have has a 120 millimeter gun on it, as well as the vertical volute suspension, and I really wanted to try and replicate this to the best of my ability. The tank in the game is very maneuverable. It's something you want to challenge the enemy with. It's not something you necessarily want to sit and camp and try and snipe with. Because it is so quick, because it is so maneuverable, and because it does have this big gun, it's actually a whole lot of fun to play with in the level 7, level 8 of the game. The Pioneer tools are here on the back of the casemate, and you can see the exhaust. It's very similar to the M26 on here, and again a good view of the vertical volute suspension on this particular tank, and you can see the way that the engine grates are from this particular picture here. So I looked in my stash to see what I had for a resource to start this whole thing with, and what I found actually was my friend Mark had this Dragon kit of an M4 Sherman that had some issues with building the horizontal volute suspension system. So he let me have the kit, and I used the hull to start the whole process on this. So I changed the decking here on the back on that M4 kit and kind of came up with some custom thing that I thought looked okay. And I used the exhaust off of an M26 Pershing to replicate the one that was in the game. You can see here it's obviously an M4 chassis, and I think the top of it sits way too high, and so I was never really quite happy with this, but I completely scratch built that enclosure for the gun. On the tank that's in the game, the transmission cover is in the rear with the drive wheel. And you can see here with the Sherman tracks, I mean, it doesn't look too bad. It's got the vertical volute suspension like in the game, but everything just sat too high. I wasn't really happy with this. And I found an answer. I found an M42 Duster kit in my spare box that I thought, you know what, this is going to be a whole lot better. I'll put a different suspension on it, and actually it is different than the game, but the T25 that this tank was based off of actually had this other kind of suspension, and I found that I was able to take that whole top part off of the Sherman, just cut it off and put it on this chassis, and it lowered it down to a point where I could now relatively be happy with how it looked compared to the one in the game. The T25 was an experimental tank, and it looked very similar to the T26, which wound up being the Pershing. So the decking on this Duster worked pretty well. It actually looked pretty close. I had to make some modifications, add some in the rear, but the stowage bins as well looked correct for the T25. You can see here I actually tried to put a gun on it from the game. I tried to go with that 120 millimeter with the muzzle brake, and it's really, really long, but it looks freakishly long and cartoonish. So the tank sat like this for a while until the T30, T34 kit came out from TACOM about a year and a half ago. And it had a couple of really neat things. It had the option of 4 different barrels. Some of them had the blast bag on them. You can see here on the right is the 120 millimeter barrel, but on the left is the 155 millimeter for the T30. And I thought, oh, that is absolutely perfect. So I took one of those barrels and voila, I had exactly what I wanted on this T25-AT.